Hello, this is Our Money, a program on anti-corruption investigations, and today's episode is mostly about ourselves, about our personal encounter with the law enforcement and judiciary systems. Let me tell you a story. In 2015, a relative of a high-ranking police official, together with his friends, robbed our camera crew. During the filming of the official's mansion, a car arrived with the relatives of two more hulks. They came out, broke into our car, dragged the cameraman out, beat him up, took the camera, took the second camera, and then they escaped. Then the case hit hard. Firstly, the official resigned. Secondly, he got into all kinds of enemies of the press ratings. Even the punishment for assault on journalists was made more strict in the law. And our case was put under personal supervision by the region's head prosecutor. However, we had to find out the assailants' names by ourselves, while the investigators, despite now having the names, witnesses, and even a video recording, weren't really in a hurry to do anything. 2 years were wasted, then another year in court, and finally, last week, the case was closed. Some changes to the documents, some outright lying by the investigator, some inattentiveness of the prosecutors, and that's it. The crime does not have an actus reus. Charges dropped. Coming next, me again. Obstruction of journalist work. Attacks. Don't touch the cameraman. Beatings. What are you doing? Robberies. Who did you give the equipment to? There's the MP's guards, I gave it to them. Killings. In 2017, we recorded 90 cases of violence against journalists. There are no precedents of effective investigations and adequate punishment, both of the 2017 attacks and attacks during the Euromaidan protests. Unpunished evil brings new crimes and attacks. The attack on Our Money camera crew. In 2015, we were filming the mansion of the family of Serhiy Chebotar, the then Deputy Interior Minister. 2 hectares of the forest were cut down to make space for the mansion. The prosecution failed to return the land to the state. When we approached the mansion's gates, a man came out, started threatening the cameraman, told us to leave. So he obstructed our journalistic activities, and then he even started chasing the cameraman. Later we found out that the person who was yelling, "Bring the knife," while he chased our cameraman was Oleg Polishuk, son-in-law of Deputy Interior Minister Serhiy Chebotar. We have the video of the attack, which clearly shows that the journalists were clearly obstructed from carrying out their legal professional duties. And it clearly falls under the Article 171 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. We left after the first attack of Polishuk, but we returned soon to finish filming the cut-down forest in the mansion. That's when we noticed we were being followed. A white Volkswagen transporter drove by several times. Unknown people watched us out of the windows. The bus we saw earlier blocked our way, but this time it lacked a license plate. 3 people got of it so quickly we didn't have time to back off. 2 of them promptly opened my door on the driver's and started taking the camera away from me. 3 people barged into the car. Oleg Polishuk was among them. I showed them the press ID, but he ignored it, threatened us, and then he took the cameraman by the throat and started choking him. They were cursing, threatening, "Quit your job or you'll get your neck snapped." So that if he sees me around his mansion once more, he'll tear my legs off and bury me. At that moment, the two young people tore pieces off the camera, ultimately ripping it out of my hands. Then the person to my right tore my dash cam off. After this, all three people got into their car and left, while we called the police and waited for them to arrive. Anyone who wants to prevent a journalist from doing their job doesn't have anything to fear. There's no punishment. The official investigation took 2 years. Interrogations, examinations, experiments, piles of requests, 7 volumes of case files, honest conversations, empty promises. The case was studied by the regional prosecutor himself. Did these people obstruct your activities? Yes. Did you have the official press card on hand? Yes. Did they take your camera and dash cam? Yes. At first, the case on a robbery by a political official's relative was investigated by the police. In 2 weeks, they didn't make any progress. 2 weeks passed, the police haven't found anyone. Today, as I've promised, we will tell about our attackers ourselves. The case was transferred to the prosecutor's office, which had 0 results in 2 months. The case went on to another prosecutor's office, and in 9 months, it was given back to the police. The police dropped the case, failing to establish the actus reus. After a scandal, the prosecutor's office reopens the case and takes it. But in 6 months, it gives it to the police, where it gets dropped yet again. 1.5 years after the attack, Polishuk's lawyer said that the battery and robbery case was dropped. The prosecution was surprised by this and decided to object. It wasn't dropped. No, it wasn't. My client, Mr. Polishuk, got notified that the case was dropped. Currently, we have info from the regional prosecutor's office. It's open. The prosecutors genuinely tried to convince us that a police investigator couldn't have dropped the case. His signature must have been forged. They even began investigating the forgery. Meanwhile, our case gets to the court. The actus reus is clearly established. The person must clearly be held responsible. I don't see any grounds for the court to decide on anything but a guilty verdict. Polishuk must answer for his crime, says the prosecutor. We can't agree more, but it was us who had to answer the most at court. We had to prove we were the journalists, then we had to prove that we didn't violate any of Polishuk's constitutional rights. I have a direct question. Which professional activity were you carrying out at the time? According to the law of Ukraine on information, Article 25, we were gathering information. The law allows me as a journalist to gather information, audio to film on video. And what specifically constituted the obstruction of your journalistic activity by Polishuk? He threatened my cameraman and chased him. He forbid me from filming in a public space. This is obstruction of journalistic activity. Isn't filming Polishuk a violation of his constitutional rights? The lawyer of a deputy minister's son-in-law tries to convince the court that publishing the video of the attack on the cameraman violates the rights of the attacker. And before publishing him running and screaming for a knife, we had to ask Polishuk for permission first. Journalists have a right to film anything in public spaces, from the street, standing, any mansions. Then we had to prove that we were harmed. I was very worried about my cameraman, who was being choked. The case was opened, seemingly investigated, got to court. For us, it was an important sign that some reforms were indeed implemented. And the fact that the case was so shamefully dropped now is a sad surprise and a big disappointment for me right now. The moment of disappointment is the last court hearing. It was attended by the police investigator whose allegedly forged signature was used to drop the case 2 years ago. His name is Serhiy Chebotar. Back then, he had explained in writing that his signature was forged, which triggered an investigation. Of course, he will be interrogated in the course of an investigation of forgery. But that was 2 years ago. Now, Chebotar just came to the court and said, "Yep, I dropped it back in 2015. All other questions he answered with, "I dropped it and I don't remember anything else." There's an internal investigation. Were you aware of the investigation? Because it says you didn't sign the decision. Yes, I am aware of the internal investigation. So did you say whether you have signed it or not? To tell the truth, I don't remember. More than 2 years have passed. This was enough for the court to decide that the case is closed. The prosecutor's office doesn't agree with this decision and has filed an appeal against the ruling. A loud statement, but the prosecutor's office de facto agreed with the ruling 2 years ago, when it completely forgot about the forgery investigation and everything that came later. The investigations, hearings, even the appeal was just an imitation. Of course, we will persist. We will file appeals. Maybe the next instance court will go better. Thousands of Ukrainians travel this path, and it's a lot harder for them. Their cases don't get publicity. Their cases don't get the regional prosecutor's personal attention. Correspondingly, there's a lot more room for violations. I'm not complaining. I've just noted a systematic trend. In 2015, it was a high-profile case. They investigated it slowly, but at least there was no direct resistance. By the way, Mr. Chebotar resigned. In 2016, the first attempts to drop the case happened, but they were exposed and they backed off. Meanwhile, Chebotar started giving his first careful interviews. It's 2018, nobody cares about publicity, case is dropped, and Chebotar openly sits on the board of the Interior Ministry. So what am I getting at? The shelf life of the reform was around 4 years. Apartments for the military is an infinite source of corruption schemes, and on the other hand, of pretentious speeches about caring for the soldiers. We have already told a story about the head of National Guard who exchanged the Kiev flats of his subordinates for flats somewhere on the outskirts, and this case is already being investigated by NABU. Today, I'll tell you another story. The Ukrbud Corporation, which was also mentioned in that report, has acquired a huge swath of the military's land as part of the Build Apartments for the Military program. Next, Maxim Apanasenko has calculated how many in the military will actually get apartments there. As children, we all traded our toys. You could trade robots for tanks, cards for a toy construction set, anything for anything, basically. The only rule was for the exchange to be fair. Children grow up, become heads of law enforcement agencies, but for some reason they forget this rule, giving military property entrusted to them for next to nothing, using the war in Donbas as a pretense. Kiev, Manitohorska Street. State Special Transport Service HQ occupies 14 hectares here. It is a military institution. In the ATO, it repairs bridges and guards railway tracks. And they decided to build an apartment complex in Kiev. The territory behind me is the Transport Service's military base. It is abuzz with heavy construction vehicles. They haven't even dug the foundation, but the complex is already classified. The service signed a contract with an investor and swore to keep it quiet. That's surprising, because the construction seemed to be a noble cause at first. One of the Transport Service's military units commissioned the building on its territory. It was termed Construction of Apartments for Servicemen and Their Families. The military will get 150 flats. The building company is Fond Development Group. 150 flats is great news. Actually, any news about flats for the soldiers is great news, be it 150, 150, or even 1. But taking into account the amount of land allocated for this, the number of flats should have been higher. The military's land will support 10 25-story buildings, a whole complex with parking spaces, a barbecue zone, and gyms. A total of 4,500 flats will be built on 8 hectares of land. The military will get less than 4% of them, but General Mykola Malkov, head of Special Transport Services, sees things differently. Maybe he would even have given the land out for free, if only to not have to sweep it. I have only 100 people on the roster, and there are 14 damn hectares of land. Who's going to clean the grounds? He counts them differently as well. He says that 150 flats out of 4,500 is 6%. Our results are twice as small. A possible future issue may be with the flat's size, but those are details, while even the percentage given by the general doesn't really seem like construction of apartments for servicemen. But this is the official reason why the construction company got the land and all the necessary permits, and the opportunity to sell 96% of the apartments. The benefit for the military itself is rather doubtful. However, the commander of the military unit is completely satisfied with the contract. Would it be better if the soldiers didn't get any flats at all? With these flats, we will be close to ending the issue with the queue for servicemen of the military unit of the administration of the Special Transport Service. The Kiev part will all have apartments. Zaychuk answered all other questions with a single phrase. It's all within the current legislation. 120 people serve in the ATO zone from my military unit alone, and we must provide accommodations for all of them, so they would feel the support, as the president says. Yeah, he also said he'd cut their hands off, but let's be honest, nobody believed that. Let me clarify it again. The problem is not the military exchanging land for apartments. The problem is there's enough land for a whole block. And they should get like 2 buildings worth of flats instead of a single riser block. Because we must provide accommodation for them. The president said so. Serhiy Chebotar, an urbanist, also thinks the number of flats is too small. If you take the conditions on that street, it should have been at least 9, 10, 12, maybe even 15%, depending on the regulations. Moreover, the expert says that building on the military's land is a long and tedious process, but the Transport Service didn't get any permissions from the Cabinet of Ministers or the Ministry of Defense. We haven't found any evidence of a competition being held to choose an investor either. Frankly, the land was stolen, and the construction isn't for the military. A paradox? 10 years ago, the Transport Service also tried to invite construction companies to its territory. They even signed a contract, which was quickly canceled in court, for misuse of land and lack of permits. But the current construction company managed to pull it off. The founder of Fond Development Group, as the ancient Ukrainian tradition goes, is a company from Belize, while the CEO is Victoria Rechana, a Ukrainian. Using her phone number, we can find a lot of ads on the internet which sell eco-friendly furniture from the Poltava region. But in her second life, she is employed in several construction firms. One of them also tried to build on the military defense's land using a similar scheme, also without permits, also with a meager number of flats for the soldiers. That construction was stopped in court for now. During the hearings on that residential complex, the prosecutor complained about the disadvantageous contract. According to the document, the company was going to give back 5% of the apartments, but later even agreed to 8%. Now the same scheme is happening on the transport services land. You can't get less than 10% on the market now. You must understand, anything less than 10% is a kickback, it's corruption. Lawyer Alexander Dyaduk has been looking into illegal construction for many years. He noticed the transport service issue back in the fall. In that contract, the investment agreement was signed for 3.3%. This means that 6.7% from the price of saved apartments, and that's millions of dollars, will end up in the pockets of generals. General Mykola Malkov has been the head of transport service for 15 years. We don't know what and how ends up in his pockets, but we can say for sure that he benefits in some way from the unequal deal with the construction company. But the general is well off in terms of property, that's for sure. Last year, Malkov sold a $75,000 plot of land in a village community near Kiev. He invested some of the money in an apartment in a nice district of Kiev, near a riverbank. That's his family's third flat. If we are to believe the phone book, the second flat of Malkov's family is here, Obolong District 29 Tumashenko Street. But his declaration mentions a bigger, more than 100 square meters apartment. It's interesting that it had appeared not long before the construction companies decided to enter Manitohorska Street back in 2007. The most interesting part of Malkov's declaration is what was humbly listed as an unfinished 60 square meter cottage. Actually, it's a mansion of about 400 square meters, and another one. Both in walking distance from the Desna River. Neither the declaration nor the state property register have the general's cottage. It's a military secret. I've had this plot since 1988. What else? The house was built in 1989. You wrote that you have an unfinished 60 square meter house, but there's more than one. There are 2 utility buildings and a pretty large mansion, which is absent from both the register and your declaration. That's the building in question, and the other building is registered in my son's name. The general himself can't get enough flats. Do you own a flat yourself? Yes, I do. I take it for myself. High-ranking military officials just love to give out apartments to their subordinates. They smile, take photos, and give fervent speeches about how the country cares. But for some reason, they don't tell the cost of building these apartments. That's it for today. This was Our Money, and my name is Dennis Bihus. You can watch any of our episodes on our YouTube channel, write us on social media, and if you have an interesting topic, feel free to email us. See you on air in a week. Goodbye.